I remember the first time I saw them, though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like anything we'd been warned about, or even what we'd prepared for. We had all read the reports about the planet, the terrain, the creatures that had been cataloged. Nothing had prepared us for the truth. Nothing had prepared us for the sky that killed. When we first landed, there was optimism in the air, thick with the kind of hope that only new settlers feel. A fresh start, a new world to shape, a frontier to conquer. The colony was bustling with activity, our equipment unloading, the settlers unloading, everyone eager to get started. We had arrived on an uncharted planet, its atmosphere breathable, its resources seemingly abundant. It was the perfect place to start our new life. The first few days were spent building, organizing, and mapping out the land. It felt like we were starting something monumental. But the sky. The sky was different. It loomed overhead in a way that made my skin prickle with unease, though I couldn't explain why. The planet was beautiful, a rich tapestry of jungle and mountain, oceans glittering beneath a thick atmosphere. It felt like we had discovered an untouched Eden. Still, there was something unnerving about the way the air felt heavy, electric, as if the planet itself was waiting for something. Then came the first shadow. We had been working on the South Ridge, just beginning to set up our communications array when a dark shape passed overhead. At first we thought it was a bird, something native to the planet. But it was too fast, too massive. I heard a low hum in the air, followed by a faint sound of rushing wind, a sound that vibrated through my chest. It was as if something enormous had sliced through the atmosphere with the power of a storm. It happened so quickly, I didn't have time to process it. I turned to look at the others, but their faces were already stricken with fear. Then, the sky opened up. The creature appeared with terrifying speed, a monstrous form diving down with an unmistakable hunger. It was a blur of motion, its wings cutting through the air with such precision that it seemed as though the wind itself was part of its design. Its size was impossible to grasp at first. I tried to make sense of it, but all I could see was terror. The wings were vast, each one the length of a shuttle, and the creature's body was covered in scales that shimmered like polished obsidian. Its eyes were the color of storm clouds, piercing and sharp, and I knew immediately that it had seen us. Screams erupted around me as it descended, its talons flashing like knives glinting in the harsh sunlight. We scattered in every direction, but it was too late. One of our team members, Aaron, was grabbed mid-flight. His scream was cut off in an instant as the creature's claws sunk deep into his torso, lifting him from the ground with terrifying ease. We heard the sickening sound of bones breaking before he was lifted high into the air, disappearing into the dark clouds above. It happened so fast, no one had a chance to react. It wasn't until the silence descended, the only sound now the wind whipping through the trees, that I realized we had lost someone. A second later, the full impact of what had happened hit me. These creatures, whatever they were, had not just attacked, they had hunted. We were not the apex predators here. We were not the ones in control. We were prey. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no clear answer. Nothing we had brought with us, no weapons, no technology, could have prepared us for something like this. There were no warning signs, no early indicators. We were blindsided, and now we were lost. The creature's appearance was just the beginning. A wave of uncertainty swept through the colony as we tried to regroup, but it was clear that our presence here had stirred something ancient, something that would not be easily ignored. The creatures that lived in the sky were not simple animals. They were predators, and we were their prey. It didn't take long before we realized that the nightmare wasn't over. We had thought that maybe it was a freak incident, a misunderstanding of sorts, but no. What happened after Aaron was taken was only the beginning. The predators didn't just strike once and vanish into the clouds like some wild animal. No, they circled above, waiting for the right moment to come again, and we were left powerless beneath them. The first few days after the attack were spent in a blur of panic. People who had once been so eager to settle, to work, now huddled together, terrified to go outside. We had lost our bravado, our confidence, and in its place, fear had taken root in our hearts. We fortified what little we could, making shelter in the dense jungle, building barricades of steel and wire around the colony's outer perimeter. It wasn't much, but it was something. Still, every time I looked up, there was that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a pulse of dread that grew with each passing day. I wasn't the only one who felt it. The others did too. At night, the air was thick with tension. People would watch the stars in silence, knowing the creatures could appear at any moment. The fear was always in the air, but what was worse than the fear was the helplessness. We could hear their wings in the distance, cutting through the air with a sound that could freeze the blood in your veins, and we knew that they were hunting again. The predators were not just mindless beasts. No, they were far more intelligent than that. They understood how we moved. They knew when we were weak, when we were too comfortable. And they knew how to exploit it. It was almost as if they were studying us. The first few attacks were direct, quick, violent. But as the days went on, their tactics shifted. They circled above, keeping their distance, watching us, waiting. It was like they were toying with us, letting us feel safe, letting us think that we could make it through another day, only to strike when we were least prepared. We tried to fight back, but the truth was we were never going to win that battle. Our weapons were useful for small skirmishes, for keeping the predators at bay for brief moments, but that was all. We learned quickly that their size, their speed, and their sheer power made them nearly invincible in direct combat. They would swoop down from the sky, claws outstretched, and we would fire in a panic, hitting nothing but empty air. We were too slow. We were too small. They were predators. And we were prey. I remember the first time one of us tried to fight back on their own. Callum, a member of the engineering team, had always been a bit reckless. He was determined, almost stubborn, and he couldn't accept the fact that we were defenseless. He constructed some crude flying device, a makeshift jetpack he'd cobbled together from our leftover equipment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him off the ground. He thought that if he could just get high enough, he could outrun them. He thought that maybe, just maybe, he could fight back. We all watched as he strapped himself into the contraption, his face set in grim determination. It was a poor idea, a desperate one, but Callum was convinced that this was the way forward. He launched into the air, rising steadily, getting higher and higher until he was out of our sight. The rest of us waited, our eyes turned to the sky. But it wasn't long before the sound of the wings filled the air again. We didn't hear Callum scream, not at first, but we saw the shape of him, small and distant, caught in the predator's grasp, lifted higher into the air. His body twisted violently as it was dragged toward the predator's nest. The jetpack sputtered and cut out, but by then it didn't matter. We never saw him again. That was the moment I realized something that I hadn't fully grasped before. We weren't just up against an animal. We were up against something older, something far more deadly. These creatures didn't make mistakes. They didn't rush. They didn't waste energy. They were precision incarnate, and we were nothing more than toys to them, small insects that they could flick away at their leisure. The realization was chilling. There was no escape. There was no grand solution. We weren't going to outsmart these creatures. We weren't going to kill them in a big, heroic fight. No, we had to adapt. We had to learn how to survive, not as conquerors, but as scavengers, hiding, evading, running. It wasn't a fight for dominance anymore. It was a fight for survival. And it was only a matter of time before they came again. We didn't know much about the creatures at first. We still don't, not entirely. But as the days turned into weeks, we started piecing together the fragments of what we had witnessed, the scars left behind, and the small, unsettling clues we'd found. The predators weren't just random beasts, they were something far older, far more intelligent. They were relics of another age, another time, and we were intruders on their world. It didn't take long for us to start hearing the whispers. The stories passed between the survivors in hushed tones, as if the very act of speaking their truth would somehow make them real. The tales of the old ones, as some had begun to call them, had been shared amongst explorers and ancient lore seekers for centuries, but no one had truly believed them. These stories spoke of creatures that had existed long before humanity set foot in the stars, beings that had ruled planets long since forgotten, predators so powerful that entire ecosystems had been shaped around them. At first, I thought it was just panic, a way for people to explain the unexplainable. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. These creatures weren't just here to hunt. They were an ancient force of nature, something designed or perhaps evolved to reign supreme over their domain. Nothing about them was random. Their size, their wings, the strange way they moved through the air, it was all part of a predatory design that was as old as the planet itself. We found their nests, or what we thought were nests, high in the mountains. At least that's where we assumed they came from. The cliffs were jagged and craggy, crumbling under the weight of centuries, but there, perched precariously on the edges of the precipices, were the remnants of something massive. Bones, huge, blackened bones that seemed too ancient to belong to anything that still lived. There were no other signs of life around them, no vegetation, no animals, but the bones were unmistakable. They were larger than anything we had ever seen, twisted and coiled in strange, unnatural shapes. These weren't just any predators. These were creatures that had shaped their own world. As we studied the bones, we realized that the creatures didn't just live here, they had once ruled it. Their remains were everywhere, interwoven with the rocks, as if they had made these cliffs their home long ago. And then it dawned on me these predators had been left behind. The world had changed around them, but they had somehow endured, surviving through the passage of time. They were relics, fossils come to life, and we were nothing but interlopers. We also discovered that they had no need for the ground. The predators were not just aerial hunters, they had evolved to be masters of the sky. Their wings, massive and leathery, were adapted to withstand violent winds and the thin air of the high altitudes. We found feathers in the dirt, but they were nothing like the feathers of birds. These were harder, like the shells of ancient crustaceans, thick and almost metallic in texture. They could glide for miles, silently cutting through the air, tracking prey from above. And when they were ready, they swooped down with a speed and precision that made them nearly impossible to avoid. There was something almost otherworldly about the way they moved. We had never encountered anything like them. It wasn't just instinct that made them perfect hunters, it was design. Their bodies were streamlined, built for speed and endurance, while their eyes, sharp and piercing, could see the slightest movement on the ground from hundreds of meters above. They didn't need to land. They didn't need to chase. They waited. They observed. And when the time was right, they struck. At first, we believed that there were only a few of them, isolated creatures, remnants of an ancient past. But as time went on, we began to realize that they were not solitary. They were part of a larger population spread out across the planet. We saw more signs of them, the footprints of their landing claws, the shredded remnants of animals they had left behind. The more we looked, the more we realized we had stumbled into their territory, a place they had once called home. We were not the first to arrive here, and if we didn't change our tactics, we wouldn't be the last. There were no simple answers. There was no manual for survival. The more we uncovered, the more we understood we were not just fighting for our lives. We were fighting to belong in a world that had already been claimed, a world where we were nothing but interlopers. And the old ones, the ancient flying predators, were not about to let us forget that. Survival became the only thing that mattered, and with each passing day, we learned more about what that truly meant. When the predators first arrived, we had fought with everything we had: guns, traps, strategies, anything that might give us a chance. But each failed attempt chipped away at our confidence, and after a while, we stopped thinking in terms of fighting back. We began thinking only about staying alive. The first step in this new approach was understanding that our biggest advantage was the jungle itself. The dense forests, the towering trees, and the swirling mist could be both a shelter and a weapon. The predators, for all their power and speed, weren't suited to the thick undergrowth. They ruled the skies, but the ground was another matter. If we could keep our feet on the earth, we had a chance. We began to shift our focus from direct confrontation to evasion and adaptation. Instead of trying to stand our ground or retaliate in kind, we became hunters of a different sort. We studied the creatures from the ground, watching their patterns from beneath the canopy of trees. We noticed that while they were quick, Their attacks were deliberate, precise. They would strike when they were sure of their target, then disappear into the sky. We realized that it wasn't the sheer number of predators we had to worry about, but the patience and intelligence behind each of their strikes. We began making use of the landscape in ways we never thought possible. We set up hidden pathways through the trees, camouflaging ourselves among vines and dense foliage. We dug into the earth, creating shelters that were nearly invisible from above. Every day became a lesson in patience and silence. Every movement had to be calculated. We became ghosts, blending into the environment, learning to move like the shadows we now lived among. But it wasn't just the landscape that became our ally, it was the technology we still had. The colony's engineers and scientists, though shaken by the chaos, refused to give up. They worked in secret, repurposing old equipment, scavenging what they could from our broken infrastructure. They made us tools we could use to fight back, though never directly. Small drones were outfitted with camouflage, capable of scouting and tracking the predators from a distance. We had never thought we'd need such things on a peaceful world, but now they were essential for survival. These drones allowed us to predict the predators' movements, to understand when they would strike next, and to plan accordingly. At the same time, we started creating barriers that could disorient the flying beasts. We set up massive nets of thick, braided vines and metals salvaged from our wrecked ships. These weren't designed to kill, but to slow them down, to confuse them long enough to give us time to escape. It was a temporary solution, but it was something. We had no delusions of defeating them head-on. That was the old way of thinking, and it had failed us. Now it was all about survival through ingenuity. We began to find a rhythm. The predator attacks, though still terrifying, became less frequent. They had to adapt to our tactics, just as we had adapted to theirs. But we were starting to win the smallest of victories, finding ways to stay hidden, to confuse and to outlast them. There was no more talk of reclaiming the colony, no more talk of building a great society. We didn't have the luxury of thinking that far ahead. Now, we were simply trying to make it through the day, one breath at a time. Some days were better than others. Some days we could walk through the jungle without fear of the sky darkening above us, of hearing the terrifying beat of wings. But those days were rare, fleeting. The predators never stopped watching. They never stopped waiting. Even when we were hidden, even when we were quiet, the weight of the sky above us was always there, a constant reminder that we were still prey. And yet, as we grew more skilled in our survival, we began to realize something important: we weren't helpless anymore. We hadn't beaten the predators, not by a long shot. But we had adapted, we had survived. And in this world, that was victory enough. The longer we stayed on the planet, the more it became clear that the predators were not simply hunting us, they were shaping our lives in ways we couldn't have anticipated. They had become more than just a threat to our survival, they had become the defining force of our existence. We no longer saw the planet as a place to build or conquer. It was a place to endure, a place where each moment was a quiet battle, fought in silence and fear. The daily routine had become almost ritualistic. Every action, every task had a specific purpose: to remain hidden, to stay alive. Even in the calmest of times, the feeling of constant vigilance hung in the air. It was impossible to forget that the creatures were out there, watching, waiting. They had taken their toll on us, but they had also taught us something. We had learned to survive not by strength or brute force, but by understanding our place in the world. We had adapted. But we were not the only ones. There were times when we could hear the predators circling above, their wings slicing through the air with an eerie rhythm. We had come to learn the sound of their flight, how it could signal their approach, how it could also signal a shift in the air, a moment of tension when they were hunting. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. The times when they didn't make a sound, when they watched us from above, waiting for us to make a mistake. Those were the moments when we were most vulnerable. It was in these moments that we knew the predators were studying us, learning from our movements, adapting in their own way. It was during one of these silent lulls that we noticed something strange. For weeks, we had stayed in the jungle, avoiding open spaces, keeping to the shadows. But one evening, when the sun began to dip below the horizon and the air grew thick with dusk, we saw something moving in the distance. A figure, too tall and too fast to be one of us. It darted between the trees, blending seamlessly with the darkening world around it. At first, we thought it was another predator, another creature, perhaps even larger than the ones we had been evading. But as it moved closer, we realized it wasn't like the others. It wasn't a beast at all. It was a person. A stranger, dressed in torn, patchwork clothing, their face hidden beneath a hood. They moved with a purpose, slipping through the trees with an ease that suggested they had been on this planet far longer than we had. We watched them from a distance, unsure of whether to approach or remain hidden. Our instinct was to stay still, to stay silent, to keep our distance, but curiosity won out. We made our way toward them cautiously, making sure to stay out of sight. As we got closer, we saw the remnants of what looked like a crude camp, a small fire smoldering, with pieces of scavenged equipment scattered around. Whoever this person was, they had been here for a long time. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. When we finally spoke to them, the stranger revealed they had been on the planet for years, surviving through methods that we hadn't even considered. They had learned the ways of the land, mastering the art of living in the shadows, using the very predators that had terrorized us as a way to stay alive. They knew how to avoid detection, how to communicate with the environment, and how to manipulate the world around them in ways that we hadn't yet imagined. In the weeks that followed, the stranger who called themselves Kale taught us things we could have never learned on our own. They taught us how to use the predator's presence to our advantage, how to observe their patterns and predict their movements with uncanny accuracy. Kale had long since abandoned the idea of fighting back. Instead, they had learned to move in harmony with the world, using stealth in the terrain to avoid the predators and survive. With their help, we began to think differently. Instead of focusing on avoiding the predators, we began to understand that we were part of a greater ecosystem, one where the creatures were not just enemies, but forces of nature. And if we could learn to move within that system, if we could adapt to it, then we might stand a chance at surviving. But it was a long, hard road. It wasn't just about hiding anymore, it was about becoming part of something larger, something older than us. Our way of life was changing. The colony we had once dreamed of was now nothing more than a distant memory. The predators had taken that from us, but in exchange they had given us something else, an understanding of how to live in a world that didn't belong to us. And with that understanding came the hope that we might one day leave the shadows and rebuild. As the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that surviving on this planet wasn't just about avoiding the predators. It was about something much deeper, a slow, quiet transformation. We were no longer simply scavengers, hiding from monsters. We had become part of the land, learning to read its language, to understand its rhythms. And yet, despite our growth, the truth was that we were still far from safe. There were times when Kale would disappear for days, returning with supplies and stories from the deeper parts of the jungle. They spoke of hidden caves and old structures, remnants of a time before our arrival. They had discovered something new every time they ventured into the heart of the wilderness. But what struck me most was the way their eyes would change when they spoke of these places. There was a spark, a hunger, a sense of discovery that told me something was pulling them deeper into the unknown. I asked them once about the structures. What were they? And why did they matter so much? Kale's response was always vague, but the look in their eyes told me they were hiding something. There was something they weren't telling us, something far beyond mere survival. The predators were not the only mystery left on this planet. It was one morning as the mist hung heavy in the air that Kale finally revealed what they had been searching for. They had discovered a hidden temple deep in the jungle, built into the side of a cliff. It wasn't just any structure, it was ancient, older than anything they had seen before. The carvings and symbols that lined its walls were unlike anything in our records, and the patterns seemed to suggest a history far older than the civilization we had come from. The temple wasn't just a relic, it was a key. Kale believed it held the answers to the creature's existence, to the origins of the predators, and perhaps even to the reason why we were drawn to this planet. At first, I was skeptical. It sounded like a fool's errand, a desperate attempt to find meaning in a world that had already shown us its brutal, unforgiving side. But Kale's conviction was undeniable. They had spent years searching for the answers, and now they had found something that might explain it all. The predators, the strange artifacts, the deadly landscape, it all seemed interconnected. We set out together to explore the temple. The journey was perilous, even with Kale's guidance. The jungle had changed since we first arrived. It was more than just the creatures that had adapted. The land itself seemed to shift, to grow more hostile. The air was thick with tension, and the distant hum of wings was never far away. But Kale led us through, undeterred by the looming threat, their eyes fixed firmly on the path ahead. The temple was unlike anything we had expected. Its walls were covered in symbols, as Kale had said, but they weren't just decorative. They seemed to tell a story, a history written in stone. The deeper we ventured into the temple, the more we realized that this was no ordinary structure. It was designed to withstand time, to protect whatever lay within. And as we approached the heart of the temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not just exploring ruins. We were trespassing. In the center of the temple, we found something that none of us had anticipated: a massive stone altar. The air around it hummed with a strange energy, as if the very walls of the temple were alive, pulsing with some ancient power. And there, carved into the stone, was a creature, the predator, but not one we had seen before. It was different, more majestic, its wings spread wide, its claws raised as if to protect something. Beneath it were smaller carvings, creatures that resembled the predators we had come to know, but these seemed to worship the larger one, as if it were their god. Kale stood before the altar, staring at the carving with a mixture of awe and fear. They had known this was here, but now that they stood before it, the weight of its significance hit them all at once. This was the origin. This was where it all began. The predators were not just ancient animals, they were part of a long-forgotten ecosystem, a designed force created to maintain balance on the planet. They were not random. They were guardians. The carvings told of a time when the world was ruled by the creature in the center, a creature whose power was unmatched, and over time it had split, fragmented, giving rise to the predators we face today. I stood there, stunned. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but they brought more questions than answers. The predators had always been feared, but now we saw them in a new light. They were not mindless killers, but protectors, shaped by a purpose we hadn't even begun to understand. As we left the temple, the weight of our discovery hung heavy in the air. The predators weren't just a threat, they were a force, ancient and powerful. And we, with our fragile, fleeting existence, were no longer the invaders we once thought ourselves to be. We were part of something much bigger, and if we hoped to survive, we would have to learn to live alongside it. The days that followed our discovery at the temple felt different. The knowledge we had uncovered, the understanding that the predators were not mere beasts, but ancient protectors of this planet, weighed heavily on us. It was not just survival anymore. It was about understanding the balance that existed here, a balance we had been disrupting without realizing it. We had always seen ourselves as victims of a world that was trying to kill us, but now the line between predator and prey blurred. The predators were not the enemy, they were guardians, keepers of something far older and far more powerful than we had ever imagined. Kale seemed different after we left the temple. They were quieter, more contemplative, as if the revelation had opened something deep within them. I could see that they were trying to make sense of everything, to understand how we could fit into this world without threatening the delicate balance that had been maintained for centuries. We had been the invaders, the ones who had thrown the system out of sync, and it was clear that the predators were trying to correct that. But how could we correct ourselves? Could we coexist with the ancient creatures, or were we doomed to remain prey, forever hunted by the skies? I spent many nights sitting alone by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, wondering about the future. We couldn't keep running. We couldn't keep hiding. But we couldn't face the predators head-on either. The temple had shown us that we weren't just dealing with animals, we were dealing with something far more intricate, a force that had been part of this planet's ecosystem long before humanity arrived. We had to find a way to exist alongside it, not fight against it. Then, one day, as we were moving through the jungle, we encountered a predator in the distance. It was one of the smaller ones, not as large as the terrifying beasts we had feared, but still dangerous. Its wings cut through the air with a sharp whistle, and its eyes scanned the ground below. The creature was aware of us, I was sure of it, but it did not attack. It simply hovered there, watching. We froze, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment we had been dreading. But then something unexpected happened. The predator did not come down. It didn't charge or dive. It simply circled above us, almost as if it were waiting. For what? For us to make a move? Or perhaps it was waiting for something deeper, something we still didn't understand. We remained still, watching it, trying to read its intentions, wondering if it was somehow testing us. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, the predator veered off, disappearing into the mist. We were left in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the encounter. Had we just been spared? Or had it simply lost interest? It was impossible to know, but one thing was certain: we had crossed a threshold. The predator hadn't attacked, hadn't hunted us. And for the first time since we'd landed here, I felt like we had a chance to change the course of our fate. In the days that followed, we began to experiment. We moved more openly, testing the boundaries of the predator's territory. We would venture into areas we had previously avoided, but instead of hiding or running, we remained still, acknowledging their presence without challenging them. Slowly, the predators seemed to lose their aggression, or perhaps they were simply beginning to understand that we were no longer a threat. We were still prey, yes, but we had become something else too, a part of the landscape, a part of the system that was neither predator nor prey, but something in between. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of fear, moments when the sky darkened and the beating of wings sent us scrambling for cover. But with each passing day, we learned more. We learned to live with the predators, to respect the ancient laws of the land, and to carve out our place in this new world. We were no longer just survivors. We were something new, adapted, altered by the planet and its creatures. We had learned the most difficult lesson of all: that survival wasn't about dominance or control. It was about balance, and as long as we respected that balance, we could continue to exist here, among the flying predators, and perhaps even thrive. The past was behind us, and the future, whatever it held, was ours to shape. We would live with the land, with the predators, and with the ancient forces that had always ruled this place. We had learned to coexist, and that, in the end, was enough.